So Codemasters have revealed that there's a new F1 game coming out.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm.
What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure?
Stay calm!
And it's going to be released earlier in the year than any of the other Codemasters titles. So that got me thinking, what are the 5 best and 5 worst things about the new F1 game being released so early in the year? Now just quickly, for those of you that have somehow stumbled upon my video before anybody else's, basically, Codemasters are releasing F1 2019 on the 28th of June this year. And of course, as usual, it's going to have all the cars from the 2019 season. We've also got some custom livery cars for multiplayer, and they have hinted in the trailer about F2 cars being in the game as well. So now you've got a bit of a background, let's get straight in to the 5 best and 5 worst things about the F1 game being released so early in the year. Now the first good point is a pretty obvious one. We've got more of the year to enjoy the F1 game whilst the season is still going on. Now the game is going to be released on the weekend of the Austrian Grand Prix, which is the 9th round of the season. So that gives us pretty much 13 rounds of the season to enjoy the F1 game alongside the real life season. Whereas usually we get, what, about 4 or 5 races, and, you know, by the time you're starting to get into the game, the season's pretty much over. And I think this is one of the areas where Codemasters have sort of let themselves down with the casual players in the past. You know, because people tend to buy games when sort of the interest is high. And if there's no F1 on the TV or in the media, people aren't going to go out there and buy the game. So, especially for the casual players, I think this is a really big one. Now for the first disadvantage, and of course Codemasters have got a little bit of a reputation in the past for having, let's say, unstable games, if I was to be kind. And that's the one big risk that they're taking. You know, F1 2015 is the only other game which has come out relatively early in the year. I think that one came out in middle of July, so not too dissimilar from this year's game. And we all know F1 2015, for those of you who have played it, was, well, it was just riddled with bugs, and it was probably the worst F1 game I've ever played. And I've played way less of that game than any other F1 game that I've ever bought. It was terrible. And I pray that it's not going to be the same again. Now, Codemasters have spent the last 2 years, apparently, working on F1 2019, which is something they actually did with F1 2015 as well. I believe they spent a couple of years doing that. The similarities that are striking me are sort of concerning me a little bit. But hopefully they've learned from their mistakes, and this isn't too big of a disadvantage. On to advantage number 2 now, and it is concerning F1 Esports, which of course has become pretty big in the last couple of years. And now that we're seeing the game being released earlier on in the year, it gives F1 a lot longer in the real life season to implement esports. I'm not quite sure what the plan is for this season. But if they do plan on going to more races, you know, say they go to Silverstone, for example, and want to do an F1 esports race there, they can actually do that now because the game is being released before Silverstone and before the bulk of the European season, which is where you'd imagine they'll probably do esports. So that's good. It gives them more chance for publicity. Once again, you know, you've got to spark the interest of people during the F1 season. If they leave the esports too late in the year, you know, if it's in, say, November, December sort of time, the season's getting to an end, the season's over, and people's interest isn't going to be as high as, you know, right in the middle of the season. It's also worth noting that I hope the game is stable enough to run esports right from the get-go. As I've mentioned before, we've had so many games that have had problems in the past. I just hope they can iron them out before the start of the esports season. Now, funnily enough, that ties me in nicely to disadvantage number 2, which is the reduction in beta testing time that Codemasters are going to have. Now, for those of you that don't know, in the past 3 games, ever since F1 2016, Codemasters have run a beta testing program where they invite a certain number of people to basically test the game and try and iron out any major game flaws. So, you know, exposing any glitch setups, any crashes that the game tends to have. And if I'm being honest, I think it's sort of had mixed success because although the beta test has ironed out some flaws in the game, the last couple of games have still had fundamental flaws in them, like the slipstream glitch from F1 2017 springs to mind. You know, that wasn't picked up in beta testing at all. And I know it's difficult to sort of pick up stuff like that quite early on, but yeah, they're not going to have any of this at all. So they're literally going to be going in raw without any sort of beta testing, unless they just sort of spring that upon us in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, there's not going to be a lot of time to iron out any big creases, which is why I fear we could have some big flaws come game release. Next up then, we have advantage number 3 of an early game release, which is that Codemasters have plenty of time to implement patches. So as I mentioned before, we could have some pretty big faults with the game when it releases, but Codemasters have got plenty of time to sort of patch the game and iron out any major creases, as I mentioned before. And hopefully we can get to a relatively stable game by the time that the game would normally be released, if that makes any sense. So I'd like to think that by the time we get to sort of late August, early September, which is where the game is traditionally released, by that point we'll have a stable game. And if at that point they choose to do F1 Esports, then, you know, they'll have, hopefully, a fair playing field for everyone, which would be good. But the next disadvantage, number 3, is that they may become too reliant on patching the game, that they'll just release a pile of shit, basically. So hopefully that isn't the case, but it doesn't give them you know, releasing the game early doesn't give them an excuse to just put it out there and then say, oh, you know, we'll patch it as the year goes on. So I've got my fingers crossed that they don't do that. If the game is at a point where they don't think it's quite finished, I'd rather them literally just put the game release back a little bit, like they did a couple of years ago on F1 2017, I believe, where they said they were going to release the game on a certain date, and then they said, no, actually, we're going to put it back a couple of weeks because the game's not finished yet. I'd rather they do that than just say, no, we're just going to chuck some patches in there in a couple of weeks, just live with our broken game for the meantime. That's just a problem with the games industry in general at the moment, is that game developers are so reliant on patches being there that they do just release broken games. But fingers crossed, Codemasters don't do that. On to advantage number 4 now, and it is the opportunity for race weekend challenges. Now, in the past F1 games, they've added like a scenario mode or a challenge mode, where you can do a set challenge, whether it be on a race weekend or just a random one. Now, I've always thought that this is sort of been quite untapped in the past. So, for example, let's say we go to the German Grand Prix weekend. Codemasters could put a challenge in there where you're Lewis Hamilton, you're starting 14th on the grid, and you've got to go and try and win the race. Exactly like he did in the real-life 2018 Grand Prix. Now, this is something I'd love to do and sort of challenge myself against my friends and, you know, even make a video out of it. I think this would be really good because it sort of spark people's interest when it's an actual race weekend. And having the game released so early in the year, as I've previously mentioned, you've got 12 or 13 opportunities to do this and, you know, get people to recreate famous past events, I guess you could say. So I've given an example for the German Grand Prix, then we could get to the Italian Grand Prix, and, you know, you're in a Toro Rosso and you've got to try and win the race, like Sebastian Vettel did back in 2008. You've got all this sort of flexibility, you know, when a race weekend is on. I've just picked 2 random examples there. But I think you get where I'm coming from. I've literally just picked those off the top of my head, and I'm really excited to see what Codemasters actually do on a race weekend. Coming on to our next disadvantage then, and I think the game could be pretty dead by the time we reach the end of the season. Of course, we'll be, what, 5 months into the game cycle, which is usually the point where people get bored of the game, and then the F1 season will be over. Is anybody actually going to be interested in playing the game at that point? I think this is where Codemasters have got to step in and really sort of add a game mode or a multiplayer which allows people to keep coming back and wanting more, even when the F1 season is dead and, you know, people aren't necessarily going to want to play F1 as their first game. So yeah, Codemasters have really got to sort of step their game up once the season ends, or else we could literally end up with nobody wanting to play the F1 game in December, January, February sort of time. And that's not going to be good. That's not going to be good if that's the case. Now, of course, for everyone that plays on PC, you've got mods that can keep the game alive. But for those on consoles and most casual players, are they really going to come back to the game 5 months in if there's nothing to sort of attract them to stay playing the game? Probably not. Now on to my final advantage, which is the publicity opportunities with releasing the game early. Now, I've sort of mentioned this before, but having a game that releases with 13 rounds left in the season, Codemasters have got so many opportunities to plug the game at race weekends. We saw last year they had signage actually at Spa, I think it was. So they were literally just advertising the game on the billboards there, and the F1 Esports series as well. You know, you've got a whole European season pretty much to ram this game down people's throats, plaster it over social media, and you know, it gives them plenty of time to try and plug the game and get more sales, really. The same goes for F1 Esports. If they choose to take the esports wagon to race weekends, you know, it's pretty easy to plug. Just plaster it over social media, and hopefully people will watch. And now, if I'm being honest with you, I didn't have a fifth disadvantage, but Arav actually sent me a tweet and said it might cut into the overall sesh times in the summer, which I do agree with. Yeah, you know, I'm not sure whether the summer is always the best time to release a game or whether it's the worst time. Although Arav's point is obviously, yeah, a little bit joking. He does make quite a good point, because you get most video games that release in the winter when people spend more time indoors, spend more time on their console. Whereas in the summer, people are more likely to be outside, you know, doing stuff. So, middle of June, is it the best time? Is it not? I guess time will tell. But of course, I've given my 5 advantages and disadvantages of an early F1 game release. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and leave a like if you've enjoyed this style of video. And if you want to see me do more F1 game discussion, just let me know once again in the comments, and hopefully I'll do more. But yeah, until my next video, guys, do take care. Bye-bye.